Chapter 28. The 10th Plague, Part 1. The Announcement. Exodus chapter 11, verses 1 to 10. And the Lord said unto Moses, Yet will I bring one plague more upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterwards he will let you go hence. When he shall let you go, he shall surely thrust you out hence altogether. Speak now in the ears of the people, and let every man borrow of his neighbour, and every woman of her neighbour, jewels of silver and jewels of gold. And the Lord gave the people favour in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the people. And Moses said, Thus saith the Lord, About midnight will I go out into the midst of Egypt. And all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh that sitteth upon his throne, even unto the firstborn of the maidservant that is behind the mill, and all the firstborn of beasts. And there shall be a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt, such as there was none like it, nor shall be like it any more. But against any of the children of Israel shall not a dog move his tongue against man or beast, that ye may know how that the Lord doth put a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. And all these thy servants shall come down unto me, and bow down thyself unto me, saying, Get thee out, and all the people that follow thee, and after that I will go out. And he went out from Pharaoh in a great anger. And the Lord said unto Moses, Pharaoh shall not hearken unto you, that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. And Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh, and the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, so that he would not let the children of Israel go out of this land. Exodus chapter 11, verses 1 to 10. In these verses, we have the introduction to the 10th plague on Egypt. The land was devastated and economically crippled. Now God planned to strike directly at the people. Death had come to crops and to animals. Now it would strike at families. The devastation in Egypt was very great, and the suffering of the people was no doubt severe. Earlier, Pharaoh's own men had cried out to him, Knowest thou not yet that Egypt is destroyed? Chapter 10, verse 7. In terms of the modern mood, many would say that Egypt had suffered enough. Joseph Parker's comment was a sound corrective to this attitude. Suffering is often mistaken for penitence. When we think of punishment instead of thinking of sin, we are very likely to think that suffering is the equivalent of contrition. We say, The poor man seemed to be suffering intensely. So he may have been, but there may have been no contrition in his heart. It was a physical or mechanical suffering, not a moral pain. Modern views of criminal quote-unquote justice are governed by this kind of sentimental thinking, so that time spent in prison, perhaps only a few years, is seen as atonement for murder. Suffering on the criminal's part has come to replace restitution. The spoiling of the Egyptians, verse 2, was God's requirement of restitution to Israel. The Israelites had to require restitution for their enforced service. This demand comes later, as does the death of the firstborn, chapter 12, verses 29 following. This last plague, God declares, will compel Pharaoh's courtiers to demand a total expulsion of Israel. Moses told Pharaoh this plainly. The palace revolt against Pharaoh was gaining ground on a pragmatic basis. Moses left Pharaoh in a great anger, verse 9. We can assume that a like anger was felt by many Egyptians. Anger, but not repentance. Pharaoh's authority was now almost altogether broken. The same was true of Egyptian religion. As Ellison pointed out, perhaps no other country in antiquity was more obsessed with death than Egypt. Their religion offered a safe passage through death to the Western world and to Osiris. Now, it was clear that Israel's God, not Egypt's, was Lord over all things, nature, life, and death. This chapter is an announcement of the 10th plague, not an account of the plague itself. The death of all the firstborn of man and beast is declared. It will affect the richest of the rich and the poorest of the poor. Verse 5. After this blow, Egypt will beg Israel to leave instead of trying to hold them. 80 years before, Egypt had drowned the male babies of Israel. The judgments on Egypt began with the Nile, and they now end with the death of all Egypt's firstborn. The Egyptians, in many cases, may have forgotten what occurred 80 years earlier, but God had not forgotten. Up until now, God had commanded Moses and Aaron to begin each plague with their outstretched staffs. God now acts directly to bring in this final judgment. In verse 1, God says, "Yet will I bring one plague more upon Pharaoh." And this is the first usage of the word plague, nega, a stroke or plague, a wounding. We are again told that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart. Verse 10. Judicial blindness is imposed by God on men after a certain point, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and convert, and be healed. Isaiah chapter 6, verse 10. A murderer cannot restore life to the man he kills. Similarly, after a certain point, he is morally, irrevocably dead in his sin, and there is no turning back. There is, then, only judgment. F.B. Meyer said, "Judgments compress into a sudden flash the inevitable results of wrongdoing." We are told, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants, and in the sight of the people. Verse 3. It was clear that the centre of power had shifted, but not religiously. Egypt made no move to expel Pharaoh and retain Moses. They recognized the power of Moses, but they later begged him to leave Egypt. They saw the power manifested, but they were by no means interested in its source. Today, we have clergymen as well as unbelievers who refuse to say that AIDS, the drought, and other judgments are coming from the hand of God. The end was near, and soon Israel would leave Egypt. This meant severe dislocation as well as freedom. Homes had been built, and local roots, despite the sufferings, were now deep. The purpose of the demand for compensation was that God did not want his people to live in poverty. In the time of judgment, they suffered, but they were also enriched. In verse 6, we are told that the death of the firstborn would result in a great cry throughout all the land of Egypt. In our time, such vocalizing is limited to sports events, to rock and roll, quote-unquote, music, and similar artificial occasions. In much of history, the basic events of life and death evoked strong responses. C.D. Ginsburg noted, "The shrill cries uttered by mourners in the East are well known to travellers. Mr. Stuart Poole heard those of the Egyptian woman at Cairo in the Great Cholera of 1848 at a distance of 2 miles. Herodotus, describing the lamentations of the Persian soldiers at the funeral of Mecisteus, says that all Boeotia resounded with their clamour. 9:24. The Egyptian monuments represent mourners as tearing their hair, putting dust upon their heads, and beating their breasts. According to Egyptian belief, Pharaoh and his order preserved the realm from disorder and death. Pharaoh was a living god, and the incarnation in the political realm of the sun, the life of the natural realm. Each night, the sun supposedly kept the great snake Apophis at bay and maintained peace and order amid the darkness. Egypt's faith was being shattered, as well as its economy. It should be noted that the Hebrew word for firstborn indicates the male line. To announce the death of the firstborn at midnight was to reduce Egypt's families, economies, and faith to confusion and defeat.